Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Ditero Magwala, and this program is brought to you by the Northern Cape Department of Education, and it is broadcast by Pagama Research and Development. So in today's lesson, we are looking at the human nervous system as well as sense organs. And today we are going to focus on the structure and functioning of the nerve. Right, so here we are going to be looking at the neurons. We're going to be looking at their structure, their functions, as well as the spinal cord, as well as the reflex action, which has to do with the spinal cord. Lastly, we will be looking at the causes and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, as well as multiple sclerosis. Okay, so as I have said, by the end of our lesson today, you should be able to describe the typical structure of a neuron. So we're going to look at the three types of neurons. You should be able to describe the functions of the three different types of neurons. We are going to be looking at those. You should be able to describe the function of the spinal cord. And you should also be able to describe the reflex action as well as the reflex arc, which has to do with the spinal cord. And you should also be able to describe the functions of neurons in the reflex arc. All right, so our pre-knowledge here is the systems of the human body, which is what we learned in grade 9. All right, okay, let's have a look at our baseline assessment before we get into today's lesson. We have one question. It says, give two functions of the human nervous system. We looked at the functions of the human nervous system in the previous lesson, whereby we were looking at the human nervous system and the central nervous system, right? So we know that here we are looking at the fact that it is able to detect changes in the external environment and internal environment and respond to those changes. So it detects the changes, interprets the changes, and then responds or reacts to those changes. And then it also coordinates various activities of the body. So for certain responses or for certain actions to take place, there needs to be coordination, and the central nervous system or the human nervous system is responsible for that. Okay, let's have a look at our terminologies for today. We have stimulus or stimuli in plural. This is any change in the internal and external environment that an organism responds to. And then we have receptor, which is a cell or a group of cells that monitors any changes in the external or internal environment of an organism. And then we have impulses. These are messages that passes along a nerve in the form of an electric impulse. And then we have effectors. These are muscles or glands that react in response to a stimulus. We've already spoken about what a stimulus is. And then we have a neuron. That is a specialized nerve cells that are found in the nervous system. We are going to be looking at the different types of neurons. We have the reflex action, which is a fast, unpredictable, and involuntary response to a stimulus. And lastly, we have the reflex arc, which is the pathway along which nerve impulses are transmitted or carried from a receptor to an effector to bring about a reflex action. So the reflex arc is a pathway that is taken by the reflex action. So you should be able to differentiate between the reflex action and the reflex arc. Like I'm saying, this is a pathway, whereas the reflex action is an action or a response. Right. Okay. So we have spoken about the central nervous system. We have spoken about the brain and the different parts of the brain. Now we are going to be looking at the other parts of the human nervous system that work together with the brain. Right. Okay. So just like any system, we did systems in the previous grades, right? So the nervous system is made up of organs. We know that systems are made up of organs, right? Such as the brain, the spinal cord, and so on. So those, we refer to those as organs. All right. Okay. So those organs, we know that they are made up of what? They are made up of tissues. And what makes up the tissues? The tissues are made up of cells. So we know that from cells to tissues to organs to systems, and then we would then have an organism. Right. Okay. So our tissues are made up of cells, and today we are going to be looking at those cells, the cells of the nervous system, which are called the neurons. So on our right here, we have a structure of the neuron. So we are going to be looking at this structure. We're going to break down the different parts of the structures or the neurons just to get a better understanding of what these neurons do in the different, these different parts do in the different neurons that we are going to be looking at. So we are going to be looking at 3 types of neurons. Right, so the neurons are made mainly of 2 parts that we are going to look at, which is the axon, as we can see here. There we have the axon, which is a cytoplasmic fiber that is connected to the cell body. This is the cell body. It is connected to the cell body and it transmits nerve impulses or impulses away from the body. Right, so that is the axon, right? And then we have the cell body, which is the part that contains the nucleus and the neuroplasm. So as we can see over there, this is where we have that cell body. Okay, so let's start off with the different parts that make up the cell body. As we have said, it is made up of a nucleus. Right, so the cell body has branching cytoplasmic threads. These threads are called the dendrites. So there we have our dendrites that make up part of the cell body, right? So what do these dendrites do? They are responsible for transmitting the impulses towards the cell body. So they transmit impulses from the previous neuron towards this cell body of this neuron, right? And then we have a nucleus in the center over here in the cytoplasm of the cell body, right? And that cytoplasm of the cell body is referred to as the neuroplasm. All right, and then we also have the mitochondria, the ribosomes, as well as the ER, which are other organelles that make up this cytoplasm. So they are also found inside the cytoplasm. All right, and then we have the axon. So as we have said, that is a long cytoplasmic growth that forms part of the neuron and it transmits impulses away from the body, right? So this axon, as we can see it over here, right, it is surrounded by a membrane called the neurolemma. Okay, so we have the neurolemma which surrounds these axons. Right, okay, and then we also have a myelin sheath, right? The myelin sheath occurs below the neurolemma and it is a fatty layer that surrounds and insulates these nerve fibers. So the insulation of the nerve fibers or the neurons makes sure that impulses are transmitted at a faster rate, right? So this means that without the myelin sheath, the impulses would not be transmitted at a faster rate. Therefore, the impulses will be very slow. They will be slowed down. So these myelin sheath provides electrical insulation and therefore it speeds up the transmission of the nerve impulses. So one of the biggest importance of the myelin sheath is to speed up the reaction. Right. So with these myelin sheath, they are divided into cells and the gaps between those cells are what we call the nodes of Reinfeldt. So those nodes of Reinfeldt would be found there, right? Okay, and then we have the axon terminals. The axon terminals are the ones that we see over here. So remember, on the one end we have our cell body. The cell body is made up of the dendrites, right? And then it is also made up of the nucleus in the middle of the cytoplasm, right? And then we have the axon terminals at the other end of the whole neuron, right? On the other side, we have these axon terminals, which have what we call the synaptic knobs at the end. So these synaptic knobs, we are going to talk about them just now. All right, so now we know that the function of the axon is to transmit nerve impulses away from the cell body. So it means that impulses will be traveling from the cell body to the axon terminals, right? Okay, so it will be transmitting this away from the cell body to a muscle or to a gland, right? Okay, so they are arranged in such a way that they lie next to each other. As we can see here, this is the axon terminal of one neuron, right? And then right there, as the axon terminals of the one neuron end, we now have the dendrites of the next neuron. There we have the dendrites, right? So here is the next neuron. So the impulse was taken from the cell body, away from the cell body by the axon to the axon terminals, right? And then from the axon terminals, we are going to see now that the impulse is going to be transmitted away from the axon terminals, which is the end of the first axon, or the end of the first neuron, to the second neuron. As we can see, the dendrites of the second neuron are over there, right? So now it is going to move away from the cell body again of the second neuron to the axon terminals of the second neuron, as we can see. So this is the direction in which impulses travel through a neuron, right? So they lie next to each other such that the dendrite of one neuron lies next to the axon terminal, or the terminal branch of the next neuron. So they lie next to each other. They don't touch each other. They just simply lie next to each other over here, and they form that gap between each other. There's a tiny gap that they form between each other, and that small gap is what we refer to as a synapse, right? So at that synapse, this is a point whereby the impulse will be transmitted from one neuron to the next neuron. We are going to look at the transmission in a bit more detail just now, right? So you would see now at the axon terminals of the next neuron, we can see the same thing taking place. There is a synapse between this. Okay, so let's say this is neuron 1, this is neuron 2, and this is neuron 3. So now there is another gap between neuron 2 and neuron 3, right? So there is another synapse there, meaning that this neuron will also transmit the impulse from the cell body towards the axon and to the axon terminals, right? So as we have said, the nerve impulse is carried across that synapse, right? It is carried from one neuron to the next through that synapse, across that synapse, whereby there is that tiny gap where the two neurons do not touch each other. It travels there, or it is carried there as an electrical impulse, right? So this electrical impulse would reach the terminal knob at the end of the axon, at the end of the axon terminals. And then when the impulse has to be transmitted from one axon to another, it is transmitted through the release of what we call a chemical, or chemicals that we call neurotransmitters, right? So these chemicals called the neurotransmitters are the ones that can transmit the impulse from one neuron to the next. And it is also very important that the two neurons do not touch each other. It is important that there is that synaptic gap, the space between the two neurons, because this makes sure that the impulses travel in one direction and in one direction only. So that transmission of impulses will never travel in the wrong direction. It will always travel from the first neuron to the second neuron going forward, right? Like I said, it is to make sure that the impulse travels in one direction, right? So the synapses are important because they ensure that impulses travel in one direction from the cell body towards the axon. You should take a note of this. Impulses always travel from the cell body to the axon. So if you are asked about the direction of transmission of an impulse, you should always know that it will always be from the cell body to the axon terminal of the neuron, right? So these synapses can be sped up or slowed down, or they can actually be blocked with the use of certain drugs. Okay, now let's have a look at the three types of neurons. We're just having a look at the different parts that make up the neurons. Now we are going to look at the three types of neurons. So the first neuron that we have is called the sensory neuron. If we have a look at the previous neuron that we looked at, you will see that the cell body was not found in a position where we find this cell body. So the cell body of the previous neuron was found somewhere here. However, now the cell body, we say it is centrally located. So you are going to find the cell body somewhere here, whereby it is actually going to form a bit of a bump, right? This is a way in which you are going to be able to differentiate the sensory neuron from the motor neuron, which we are going to look at just now. So this sensory neuron carries impulses from the receptor. Now, remember, the receptor are parts of the body or parts of the sense organs that are going to receive that stimulus from the external environment. So any change that happens in the external environment. Any stimulus from the external environment is going to be received by this receptor. So the receptor is responsible to receive, right? So it transmits, the sensory neuron carries impulses from the receptor to the brain and to the spinal cord. So this is the first part that transmits impulses, right? It has a centrally located cell body, as I have said, right? And then the dendrites are found on one end and the axon terminals on the opposite end, just like the one that we looked at just now. The only difference is that it does not have the cell body attached to the dendrites in this case. And then secondly, we have the motor neuron, which is the one that is similar to the one that we were looking at previously, right? You can see that the cell body now is over here. You should make sure that you are able to differentiate this, and it is very easy to differentiate this. So this one with the cell body at the end, that is the motor neuron, and the previous one with the centrally located cell body or centrally situated cell body, this is the sensory neuron, which transmits impulses from the receptor towards the brain. So we can see the dendrites here attached to the cell body, and then we can see that the impulse will travel from the cell body towards the terminal of the axon, or the axon terminal, right? And we can see on the inside we have our axon, which is surrounded by the myelin sheath, right? So the motor neuron now, it carries impulses from the central nervous system. Remember, when we talk about the central nervous system, we are referring to the brain or the spinal cord. So this one is the one that takes the impulses from the brain or the spinal cord to the effectors. So we call these ones the effectors. Effectors would be the muscles or the glands. The muscles or the glands would be the ones that are going to now bring about a reaction, right? So the muscles or the glands, the muscles would relax and contract to bring about a movement or any kind of a reaction, whereas the glands are going to secrete certain hormones or inhibit the secretion of certain hormones, right? So the sensory neuron transmits impulses from the receptor, which receives a stimulus from the external environment, to the brain. Now the brain interprets this impulse, right? And then it sends a message back to the muscles. So let's say you have placed your hand onto a hot surface, right? The receptors in your hand or in your skin are going to receive that stimulus of heat, right? And then they're going to send this impulse through the sensory neuron to the brain. The brain is going to register that information and send an impulse back to the hand so that the hand can move away from that hot surface, right? It sends this message using the motor neuron, right? It sends the message to the effectors. So the effectors again are found here. They are the ones that are going to bring about a reaction or a change again, right? So now the cell body of the motor neuron is found on one end and the axon terminals on the other end, unlike with the sensory neuron, which has that centrally located cell body. The last one that we have, remember we said there's 3 neurons. The last neuron that we have is called the connector neuron, and its function is just that. It is to connect. It is the connector neuron because it connects the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. So between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, there is that connector neuron that will transmit impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So it is also called the interneuron because it is in between these two, right? So the connector neurons would carry impulses from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. And all of this would occur inside the central nervous system. So it will either occur inside the spinal cord or inside the brain. So this one, it is just shaped just like the motor neuron. However, it is much shorter than the motor neuron. As you can see, there's the cell body, the dendrites, the axon terminals, the nucleus, and the axon. Remember, the axon is surrounded by that myelin sheath. Okay, let's have a look at our first activity. It says the diagram below represents a possible path followed by an impulse when a person touches a hot plate, right? So the hot plate being touched would be a change in the external environment, right? And then remember, there are receptors on the hand that are going to receive this stimulus. Okay, so we have these parts that we can see over here. Let's just start by trying to label this before we get to the questions actually. So let's start with A. Okay, let's start by identifying the sensory neuron. Remember, we are able to differentiate between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. So the sensory neuron would be this one. Why do we say this is the sensory neuron? Because of the centrally situated cell body. So if this is the sensory neuron, it means that because the receptor receives impulses and transmits those impulses to the sensory neuron, it means that this would be the receptor. F would be the receptor, and then this would be the sensory neuron. And then here we would have the myelin sheath. And then here we have that synapse. As we can see, there is the synaptic contact there taking place. And then we have C. C would be our connector neuron. And then B would be our motor neuron. And lastly, we have the effectors. So the effectors are the ones that are going to react, right? So there is going to be a reaction by these effectors. Remember, the effectors can either be glands or they can be muscles. Okay, 1.4.1, it says, name the path represented in the diagram, right? So we haven't looked at the reflex arc, but the path would be the reflex arc. We're going to look at the reflex arc in the next few minutes, but that is what we call the reflex arc, right? And then 1.4.2, it says identify the type of neuron represented by B, C, and E. So we know what is B, C, and E. So remember, B is the motor neuron, C is the connector, E is the sensory. So B would be our motor neuron, C our connector or interneuron, and E our sensory neuron. Right. 1.4.3, give the letter only of the part that represents the receptor and the effector. Right. Let's go back to our diagram. So now we have the receptor at F and the effector at A. So as you can see, this method of labeling the diagram before you get to the question makes things much easier, because now when you answer the questions, you just go back and check the answers as you have already labeled most of the parts, right? So for the receptor would be F, right? And then for the effector, it would be A. Okay. And then it says give the letter and name of the region where the impulse is transmitted chemically. So the region where the impulses are transmitted chemically would be the synapse, right? Remember, we have the neurotransmitters or the chemicals that are responsible for transmitting that impulse from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, or from the sensory neuron to the connector neuron, right? So the region where impulses are transmitted chemically would be the synapse, and the synapse is found here at part D. So that would be D. And then part B, it says the part that has an insulating function. Remember, the part that has an insulating function would be our myelin sheath. So our myelin sheath is part G. So the myelin sheath surrounds the axon and it makes sure that impulses travel a bit faster. So that is what we have over here. So that insulation function, that is the myelin sheath, and it is part G. Okay, let's have a look at that. So the letters here on 1.4.3, it would be F and A, and then synapse D, the myelin sheath G. All right, now let's move into the spinal cord. Right, so here we are going to be looking at a brief structure of the spinal cord. We are then going to look at the function of the spinal cord and how the spinal cord works in the reflex action or the reflex arc. Right, so this spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata. So remember, the medulla oblongata is quite at the bottom of the brain, right? It is like the last part of the brain. So it now connects from there, it extends into the vertebrae of the spine, and that is where the spinal cord would have started. So the spinal cord starts when the medulla oblongata ends, right? So it is like the medulla oblongata in that the gray matter is found on the inside and the white matter is found on the outside, and it has that H shape. So remember, the cerebrum and the cerebellum has the white matter on the inside and the gray matter on the outside. So in this case, the gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. The gray matter is on the inside and the white matter is on the outside, and it forms that H shape, right? And it is found in the vertebral column of the body, which offers a whole lot of protection for the spinal cord. Okay, and then we have a tiny canal that is found in the center of the gray matter, right? And that tiny canal is called the spinal canal, and it is filled of the cerebrospinal fluid, right? Just like the brain, the spinal cord is also protected by the 3 meninges in the brain, right? And there are about 31 pairs of spinal nerves that enter and leave the spinal cord through those openings of the vertebrae. So as they enter and leave these spinal nerves, as they enter and leave the spinal cord, it means that impulses are being transmitted to the correct place. All right, so now we are looking at the structure of the spinal cord, which is made up of the dorsal root as well as the ventral root. Right. So now with the dorsal root and the ventral root, these are the roots that, or the pathways that both the sensory neuron and the motor neuron travel through. Right. So here we have the dorsal root, whereby the sensory neuron will be traveling through the dorsal root. And we also have what we call the dorsal root ganglion. So this ganglion here is like a bump that would be able to accommodate the cell body of the sensory neuron. So that is also one of the ways in which you are able to identify or differentiate between the motor neuron and the sensory neuron when you are looking at the spinal cord. So right in the dorsal root, you would see the dorsal root ganglion, and then you would know that it means that here we have the sensory neuron entering the spinal cord. Remember, the sensory neuron is coming from the receptors. It is receiving that stimulus from the external environment, and it is now transmitting it to the central nervous system. By central nervous system, we are referring to the spinal cord or the brain. Right, now within the spinal cord, we would then find the connector neuron, which it would then connect the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. Now remember again, as these impulses travel through any of the neurons, remember it would start from the cell body, or it would start from the part where there's the dendrites, and then from the dendrites it will travel through the axon to the axon terminals, and then from there the axon terminals with the dendrites of the next neuron would form that synaptic gap, whereby the impulse will move from the first neuron to the second neuron, and from the connector neuron to the motor neuron. Now in the ventral root, this is where we would now find the motor neuron, right? So the motor neuron is found in the ventral root, and then the sensory neuron is found in the dorsal root. So do not focus on which one is at the bottom and which one is at the top. Just focus on the structure of the neuron. As you can see, they are the cell bodies, or focus on the presence of the ganglion. Wherever there's the ganglion, that means there is the sensory neuron, right? So we have the dorsal root and the ventral root, as I have said. So these are the part of the spinal nerves. The sensory neuron enters via the dorsal root, whereas the motor neuron leaves. Remember, the motor neuron leaves the spinal cord or the central nervous system. It leaves as the central nervous system has interpreted the impulse that it received. Now it is sending a message back, or an impulse back, to the effectors, so that the effectors can bring about a response, so that the effectors can either they can either contract or relax for a reaction, or for the glands to also react by releasing a hormone or inhibiting the release of a hormone. Right. Okay. So as we can see here, we have the synapse between the sensory neuron and the connector neuron, and then we have another synapse between the connector neuron and the motor neuron. Now, if we have a look at the diagram from the previous slide, this one, I just said that you should not always think that the motor neuron is found at the bottom of the spinal cord and the sensory neuron is found at the top. If you have a look at this diagram, you would see that it is different from this one. What makes it different is the position now. You can see that now the sensory neuron is on this side and the motor neuron is on the other side. Now we can see there we have the receptor. What is the receptor going to do? It is going to receive the impulse from the external environment. Now this receptor receives the impulse and it receives the stimulus, It receives the stimulus and then it converts the stimulus into an impulse. Right, and then this impulse is now going to be transmitted by the sensory neuron into the central nervous system, into the brain or into the spinal cord. Right, there we can see the dorsal root ganglion again. We can see the cell body over there again. So into the spinal cord, now there is that synaptic contact between the sensory neuron and the connector neuron. So now the terminals of the axon will transmit the impulse chemically from the sensory neuron to the connector neuron. Then the impulse will be transmitted through the connector neuron, from the connector neuron to the motor neuron. Now remember, this means that the impulse has been interpreted and a message is now being sent back to the effectors. Right, now another synaptic contact here between the dendrites of the motor neuron and the terminals or the axon terminals of the connector neuron. Now synaptic contact is taking place and an impulse is transmitted from the connector neuron to the motor neuron. Now the motor neuron through the ventral root, remember dorsal root is the sensory neuron, ventral root is the motor neuron, which will then transmit the impulse to the effector. So this would be our effector, which is what? A muscle or a gland, which would respond accordingly. Right, so remember the gray matter on the inside that represents the spinal cord or the medulla oblongata. So this is the spinal cord, and then the white matter would then be found on the outside. Okay. Right, so remember, once in the spinal cord, the sensory neuron would make synaptic contact with the connector neuron. As we have seen here, they have made that synaptic contact, right? And then the connector neuron would make synaptic contact with the motor neuron, right, in the ventral root, and the motor neuron would transmit the impulse from the brain now or the spinal cord now to the effectors, which are going to react. Right, okay, so the main functions of the spinal cord now would be to serve as a pathway for impulses between the brain, the sense organs, and the effector organs. So from the sense organs, whereby we find the receptors, to the spine, to the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons are going to send the message now to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will send this message to the brain, where it is interpreted, and then from the brain back to the spinal cord, through the spinal cord now back to the effectors through the motor neuron. Right, okay. And then this spinal cord also plays a very important role in reflex actions such as coughing and blinking of the eyes. We are also going to be talking about the reflex actions. As I have said, we're going to look at what happens during a reflex action and what is a reflex arc. Right, so now let's get to that. So these are fast, unpredictable, and involuntary responses to a stimulus. So whatever change that can happen, whatever stimulus your body can receive that requires you to have a very, very fast or quick response to that change or that reaction would be referred to as a reflex action. So these are usually situations whereby your body can be harmed, right? So the reflex action takes place so that you can protect yourself or your body from being harmed in such a way that you are going to be able to react so quick. Even before you can even think a lot about it, you would have already reacted. And this is because we can see that the reflex action or the reflex act does not include the brain. So the impulses are transmitted to the spinal cord and quickly back to the effectors without even being sent to the brain. However, some impulses will still be sent to the brain so that the brain can be able to now react afterwards. So, for example, if you step on a nail, you're going to move your leg from that nail as quick as possible. So that is an example of a reflex action. However, the brain is going to now register that and then register the pain, and you are going to now react to that as well. Right. So the reflexes occur over neuron pathways called reflex arcs. So a reflex arc is the pathway, and then the reflex action is the response that is taking place in that pathway. So this involves both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Right. Okay. And then a reflex arc is a pathway along which nerve impulses are transmitted or carried from the receptor to an effector. Right. So the pathway whereby nerve impulses are carried from the receptor to the effector to bring about a reflex action. So like I said, this kind of a reflex action would be taking place between the receptors, the effectors, and the spinal cord without involving the brain in this case, because we do not want the impulses to travel all the way to the brain. Right. Okay, so what does the reflex arc basically involve? Right, it involves the spinal cord, no brain, just the spinal cord. It involves the spinal nerves that have the sensory, the connector, as well as the motor neurons. So these make up part of the peripheral nervous system, basically. And then they also include a receptor as well as an effector. So the receptor will be the one that receives, and then the effector will be the one that is going to bring about the change. Right. Okay, as we can see here, we have the receptors in the skin, which can either feel the heat or feel the pain, right? And then we have the sensory neuron, which is transmitting the impulses from the hand to the central nervous system, right? In the central nervous system, we are looking at the spinal cord and not the brain in this case. And then we have our connector neuron here, and then an impulse will move from the spinal cord through the motor neuron, or the ventral root of that spinal cord through the motor neuron to the effectors, whereby the effectors are going to now respond. Right. Okay, let's have a look at this explained step by step. Right. So this is an example whereby an individual is going to pick up their hand from a hot surface. So heat receptors in your finger will pick up the stimulus. So the stimulus is the change. What changes this is the hot surface, right? And then these receptors convert a stimulus into a impulse. You should know this. From the receptors, or the stimulus, basically. We have the stimulus, which is the change. This stimulus is going to be received by the receptors. Now the receptors are going to convert the stimulus into an impulse. Now we no longer have an impulse. We no longer have a stimulus, but we have an impulse. Now this impulse is going to be carried by the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. So impulse, receptor, stimulus, receptor, impulse. From the impulse, we have the sensory neuron that carries that impulse to the spinal cord. Right. Now, within the spinal cord, remember we have that connector neuron. And then from there, we are going to have the motor neuron carrying the impulses from the central nervous system to the receptor effectors. However, before that, let's just have a look at a bit more details of what happens in the central nervous system. So remember, the sensory neuron have carried that impulse from the receptors now to the central nervous system. So the sensory neuron will make a synaptic contact with the connector neuron. So basically, we have our stimulus, which is received by the receptor, and this receptor is going to convert that stimulus into an impulse. Right, now into the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, the impulse is going to be carried by the sensory neuron. Now in the sensory neuron will make synaptic contact with the connector neuron. So remember, there's gaps between these two. There's going to be a synaptic gap, right? Now, or a synapse. So now we have the synaptic contact between the sensory neuron and the connector neuron. Between the connector neuron, from the connector neuron, there's going to be another synaptic contact between the connector neuron and the motor neuron. And lastly, now the motor neuron will transmit this impulse to the effectors, and as we have said, these effectors are going to react. So now the connector neuron in turn makes synaptic contact with the motor neuron, which is going to leave the spinal cord. How does it leave the spinal cord? It leaves the spinal cord via the ventral root. So always the motor neuron will leave through the ventral root, whereas the sensory neuron will always enter through the dorsal root. Right, now the motor neuron has carried the impulse to the muscles or the effectors of the arm that has touched that hot surface, right? So now the muscle can be able to contract and the hand will move away from that flame, right? So now the hand is able to move away from that flame, and that is how the hand will be able to prevent itself from being harmed. Because if the central nervous system took very long to respond to any changes, it would mean that by the time you realize that you are burning, you would have been harmed already, right? So the muscles, which are the effectors, are then going to contract and the hand is going to be moved away from that flame, right? So that action of pulling the arm or the hand away from the flame is what we refer to as a reflex action. And then the reflex arc would be the pathway that has been followed in order for this reflex action to take place. So the path that the impulse travels to bring about a reflex action is called a reflex arc. So the reflex arc is the pathway, and the reflex action is the action that takes place. So as I have said before, we start off with the stimulus or the stimuli. It can either be an internal stimulus or an external stimulus, right? And then the stimulus is going to be received by the receptor. So the receptor receives the stimulus. So in this case, it is a cell or an organ of the central nervous system. Okay, now from the receptor, we are having the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron will carry, remember, it has converted the stimulus into an impulse. So now the sensory neuron carries the impulse to the central nervous system. What happens in the central nervous system in the spinal cord? If we are looking at reflex arc in the spinal cord, there's going to be coordination, or that is the coordinator, and that spinal cord will then send impulses back to the effector. So it sends the impulses back to the effector through the motor neuron. Right, so the motor neuron will carry this to the effector. Remember, between the motor neuron and the between the motor neuron and the connector neuron, there's going to be another synaptic gap. Right, now from the motor neuron to the effectors being the muscles or the glands. Right, and then there is going to be a reaction. So it can be a movement. In this case, the hand will be picked up away from that hot surface. So it can be a movement or it can be a secretion behavior whereby a hormone is being secreted. All right, let's just have a view of that scenario again. So there we have a hot object, we have a hot pot in this case, and then the first thing that is going to be involved here is the receptors. So this is our stimulus. Right, that is our stimulus or the stimuli. This stimuli is going to be received by the receptors. Now the stimuli is received by the receptors and it is going to now move through to the spinal cord through the sensory neuron. Remember, the sensory neuron are going to enter the spinal cord through the dorsal root. As you can see there, we have that dorsal root ganglion, and we also have that cell body, right? So now through the dorsal root into the spinal cord, and we can see over here, there's that interneuron, and there's that synapse between the sensory neuron and the interneuron. And then from the interneuron, we are going to have synaptic contact between the interneuron and the motor neuron. Now the motor neuron will be able to leave the spinal cord or the central nervous system through the ventral root back to the effectors, right? So the effector here would be part 6, whereby the hand is pulled away from that hot surface. Okay, so remember, as I have said, the reflex action or the reflex arc does not include the brain. Why? We do not need the impulses to go all the way to the brain in order for an individual to be able to respond as quickly or as rapidly as possible. Right. Now, what is the importance of this reflex arc? Right? So all the reflex actions have evolved to help us survive. So as I have said, they are there to help us or to save our bodies from being harmed or being damaged, right? So they help us to survive. So the kind of reflexes that we are talking about things like coughing. So remember, when you cough, you release certain substances, right? So it prevents the lungs from being damaged, and efficient exchanges of gases can take place. And then we have a pupil reflex. This is the changes that would happen in the eye, right? So when we have these pupil reflexes, it is in order to prevent damage of the sensitive cells of the retina by the UV light rays, right? And then we have a knee jerk. The knee jerk is what helps support the body weight during walking. So when walking, we are experiencing some knee jerks, which are reflex actions as well, right? And then we have swallowing. The swallowing process would prevent food from entering the respiratory pathway, and it will also prevent choking. Okay, let's have a look at our second activity. This is activity 2. We have a structure of the reflex arc. So we're going to label it again before we get to our questions. Right. Okay, let's have a look at this. We have part A. We have the dorsal root ganglion. Right. So with the dorsal root ganglion, we know that this means this is the sensory neuron. Now, if this is the sensory neuron, it means that here we have what? The receptor. If this is the receptor, it obviously means that this is the effector. And then part B would be the motor neuron, which is living through the ventral root. Remember, dorsal root, we see the dorsal root ganglion, sensory neuron. And then here, this would be the spinal cord or the spinal canal. All right, let's say the spinal canal, and then the spinal cord, and E would be the connector neuron or the interneuron. Okay, let's move on to the questions. 2.1.1, it says give labels for each of the following region D and neuron E. So region D would be the spinal cord and E would be the connector neuron, right? So the gray matter of the spinal cord. Remember, the spinal cord is made up of gray matter on the inside and white matter on the outside. So that is the gray matter, and then this would then be the white matter on the outside. And then neuron E is the connector neuron, right? The interneuron or the connector neuron, right? And then 2.1.2, it says write down the letter of the part which transmits impulses to the central nervous system. So that is the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron is part A. Okay. Let's have a look at the next question. The part that contains the cerebrospinal fluid. The part that contains the cerebrospinal fluid would be the spinal canal, which is part C. Right. Okay, so we have A, which is the sensory neuron, and C, which is the spinal canal. Okay, now let's have a look at 2.1.3. It says explain the effect on the reflex action if part B was damaged. So remember when we looked at when we were discussing the previous lesson, I mentioned that it is very important for you to understand the functions of the different parts of the central nervous system. So be it the spinal cord, be it the brain, you need to understand all of these parts. Why is it important for you to understand all of these parts? Because of questions like this, whereby they say, what would happen if part A is damaged, if part B is damaged? So in this case, what would happen to the reflex action if part B is damaged? You first need to know what is part B, then know what is the function of part B. Part B is the motor neuron. What does the motor neuron do? Remember, the motor neuron transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the effectors in order for an individual to be able to react. Right. So if part B is damaged, it means that the person would be able to receive the impulse, right? To receive the stimulus. However, the person will not be able to react because the motor neuron will not be able to transmit an impulse to the effectors in order for the effectors to be able to respond. Right. So sensation will be felt. However, there would be no response because the motor neuron is not functioning. 2.1.4. The nerve pathway in the above response is about 1.5 meters, right, in length. Okay. A nerve impulse travels 75 meters squared. No, per second, sorry. And then it says, use this information to calculate the time taken for this reflex action to occur. Show all your working. So here we are looking at the time it takes, right? We are using what? Time, the distance and speed, right? We know that speed is equals to distance over time, right? So we have what? We have speed, we have distance, we are looking for time. So we would multiply the speed by the distance in order to get our time. We're going to divide. Okay, so we have our 1.5 meters divided by the speed, and we are now going to get the time, which is 0.02 seconds, which is a very short space of time. Right. And then the last part here, it says, explain the significance of the reflex action. We have just spoken about that. We know that it helps to protect the body by reacting quickly. So it is very important for certain reactions to be very quick in order for the body to be protected from being harmed. Right. Okay. Now, let's look at this question again. It is the same diagram. We can see that we have the different parts as they are labeled differently. So again, this would be the sensory neuron, and then this would be the connector, and then we have the synapse, and then we have the motor neuron at C, we have the receptor, and we have the effector neuron, the effector. Right. Now, remember again, the dorsal root, that is how you identify the sensory neuron. Okay, so the first question here says, what is a reflex action? So we know that reflex action is that action that is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. Right, so quick automatic response to a stimulus. Right, now it says label the following: the functional connection at D and neuron B. So let's have a look at the connection at D. The connection at D, it is the synapse or the synaptic synaptic contact, right? So it is the synapse or the synaptic contact. And then the second one, it was saying neuron B. What is neuron B? Neuron B is between the sensory and the motor. So neuron B would be the connector neuron, right? So we have the synapse and the connector neuron or the interneuron, right? And then we have 233. It says state the significance of the functional connection at D. What is the importance of the synapse? Remember, the synapse is important in making sure that the impulses travel in one direction, right? So it ensures that impulses move in one direction only. It prevents the continuous stimulation of the neurons. So it allows for the stimulation to stop at some point, right? Remember, it can be stopped, it can be sped up, it can be slowed down using drugs at that point. And then it ensures that the impulse is transmitted from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Again, that is in the correct direction, basically. Right. Okay. The next question says, write down in the correct order the letters only of the neurons involved from the time a stimulus is received until a response takes place. Right. So a stimulus is received. It would be starting with the sensory neuron. So in the correct order, it would be A, connector neuron, B, motor neuron, C. So it would be in that order. A, B, C. Right. And then 2.3.5, explain the consequences for a reflex action if neuron C is damaged. What is neuron C? Again, it is the motor neuron. We know that if the motor neuron is damaged, the stimulus will be received. The stimulus will be received. The person will be able to interpret what is happening. However, there will be no response. Right. So the person will be able to receive the stimulus, but they will not be able to respond. Okay. And then the last question says, draw a labeled diagram to represent neuron A. We know that neuron A is the sensory neuron. So here you would be expected to draw a diagram of the sensory neuron. Every diagram comes with a caption. Make sure that every diagram that you draw comes with a caption. That is 1 mark, and then 4 marks for any of the labels. Make sure that you have enough labels so that you can get all of the marks. Okay, lastly, we are just going to quickly have a look at the 2 disorders of the nervous system. We have the Alzheimer's disease and we have multiple sclerosis, right? So Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder which is characterized by the loss of neurons and synapses in the brain. If there's loss of synapses, it means that that synaptic contact and that transmission of impulses from one neuron to the next would be lost as well, right? So in most cases here, we would experience the symptoms in individuals who are actually up at the age of 60 and above, right? And so far, the causes of Alzheimer's disease are not known. However, we know that the loss of neurons and the synapse at the brain would take place when this happens. Now, how do you see that a person might have Alzheimer's disease? You would see that they would sometimes have memory loss, mainly memory loss, as well as confusion. And remember, this is something that affects individuals around the ages of 60. And then the second one we have is multiple sclerosis. This is a disorder that is caused by the damage to the myelin sheath. Remember, the myelin sheath insulates the axon, and the axon transmits impulses. And the myelin sheath helps to speed up the transmission of these impulses, right? So this one can affect young adults between the ages of 20 and 40. And just like Alzheimer's, the causes of multiple sclerosis are also not known. And the symptoms are also similar here. We have memory loss, we have loss of speech and vision, and we also have pain and fatigue. Okay, so those are the 2 disorders of the nervous system that we can experience, right? Okay, let's have a look at our summary. So remember, the nervous system is made up of cells. Those cells are called neurons. We have 3 types: the sensory, the motor, and the connector neuron. And there is the transmission of impulses in that order. And then secondly, impulses are transmitted from the one neuron to another through synapses. And then the spinal cord serves as a pathway for impulses between the brain, the sense organs, and the effector organs. So the sense organs to the brain and back to the effector organs for a reaction. And then the reflex actions help us to prevent the body from being harmed by reacting rapidly to changes from the external environment. Okay, so when you are looking at a reflex arc, this is where you must, these are the things that you must remember. First, it is the stimulus from the external environment. That stimulus is going to be received by the receptor. It's either in the skin, in the eyes, and so on. The receptor, usually it would be in the skin because we are trying to prevent harm to the body here. right? So the receptor would receive that stimulus, either pain, heat, and so on. From there, it will transmit that impulse. The stimulus is converted into an impulse by the receptor. Now we have an impulse which is transmitted by the sensory neuron. Where does it transmit it? It transmits it to the central nervous system, within the central nervous system to the interneuron. Synaptic contact between the sensory and the interneuron, and then synaptic contact between the interneuron and the motor neuron. The motor neuron will transmit this to the effector, and that means that the person will be able to respond. Now, we have seen a question whereby you were asked what would happen if the motor neuron is damaged and there would be no response, right? But the stimulus will be received. So a question that you can also ask yourself, what would happen if the receptor is damaged or the sensory neuron is damaged? It means that the person will not be able to receive the stimulus, meaning that the person will not even be able to feel the pain. However, when the person is able to receive the stimulus, they are able to feel the pain, and the motor neuron is not functioning. They will feel the pain, but they will not be able to respond. Okay, so in our next lesson, we will still be looking at parts of the central nervous system. In this case, we are going to focus on the human eye, right? Okay, we have our homework there. Go and have a look at the homework. It is based on the reflex arc as well as Alzheimer's disease. Okay, we will discuss that in the next lesson. Okay, we have come to the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.